Imagine a world millions of years in the future. A world where evolution has written a new chapter in the story of life. The world is inhabited by very strange creatures, like nothing the Earth has ever seen. 100 million years in the future, a warm, shallow sea stretches for thousands of kilometers. Only 50 meters deep at most, the sea covers what was once dry land. The shallow water is full of strange, plant-like structures. And bizarre creatures that thrive in the sunlight and the warmth. Some spend all their time underwater, while others float on the surface. In 100 million years' time, the climate is warm and stable, and the sea level 150 meters higher than today. The sea now covers more than 4/5 of the Earth's surface, changing the face of the globe beyond recognition. Carbon dioxide from volcanoes has created a massive greenhouse effect, melting the ice caps. More important, the warmer water in the oceans has expanded, taking up more room and flooding the continents. But there's another reason the sea level is so high. More volcanic activity means that deep underwater, on the mid-ocean ridges, molten rock is pushing up from below, trying to erupt, actually forcing up the ocean beds.
If these bulge up, they displace the water in the oceans outwards off the ocean, from the ocean basins off onto the continents. It's as though you took your tub and you started to push up on the bottom of the tub, and ultimately a tub full of water will flow out over the margins to either side.
So all the low-lying land on the continents is covered by salt water, shallow enough for plenty of light to reach the seabed. And in this warm water, evolution could run riot. This is an ocean phantom. Ocean phantoms are huge. They can grow up to 10 meters long. Yet this complex-looking creature is really a jellyfish.
The ocean phantom is an enormous floating jellyfish. It's not just any kind of jellyfish, though. It's a specialized jellyfish called a siphonophore. And 100 million years from now, it's the largest creature floating in the oceans. But in today's seas, we have large siphonophores. They're called Portuguese men-of-war. They're made up of not just one jellyfish, but a whole collection, a colony of individual smaller jellyfish that play different roles in the colony. And some of them are used for catching food, and some of them are used for digesting food, and some of them are used for propulsion, and some of them are used for making babies. Now, Now, in 100 million years, the ocean phantom takes this basic design to a whole new dimension. It's the largest thing floating in the sea. It's a collection of these specialized jellyfish that all play different roles, and it has an enormous impact on the reef environment.
The ocean phantom is made of separate jellyfish, each with their own role to play. Some of them form sails, which harness the wind and carry the ocean phantom across the surface. Others act as large floats, filled with carbon monoxide to stop the phantom sinking. And yet others hang below the surface, members of the colony that reach down and grab the phantom's food. An ocean phantom is like a floating city. A whole community supporting itself as it's blown across the ocean.
Now, do they just blow downwind, crashing into rocks and bays and just being tossed up on beaches all over the world? Or can they manage to navigate upwind? Can they move around in a more controlled fashion? Now, today's Portuguese men-of-war and a small jellyfish called the velella can actually sail upwind with their sails pushing against the tentacles trailing in the water. And perhaps our ocean phantom can do that, but even better.
The ocean phantom's sails work like those of a sailing ship. By pumping water into the sails, the phantom can raise and lower them, and turn them, depending on the direction of the wind. So it can sail across the wind, like a well-crewed galleon. The ocean phantom is much more sophisticated than today's jellyfish. The simple nerve net of a modern jelly has become more elaborate, connecting all the different individuals to a city-wide network. Communication is so efficient, the phantom can even steer itself. Specialized polyps in the stern act as rudders. So the ocean phantom uses this elaborate sailing system to cruise the shallow sea, searching out the richest areas where it might find food. And the best place to search is a reef, where, swimming among the plant structures, are reef gliders. Reef gliders aren't fish, but swimming sea slugs. Sea slugs are around today. They're marine snails without an obvious shell. Brightly colored, flamboyant, most sea slugs live on the ocean bed. And they're carnivores. In the future, sea slugs are not so brightly colored, but they're much more mobile.
These sea slugs have given up crawling, but they've taken up flying through the water. They fly by flapping wings along either side, and they have a whole series of wings down their sides. And it turns out that the order in which these wings beat is very important to efficient propulsion.
The wings beat in turn, starting at the back, rippling towards the front of the glider. Swimming like this, a reef glider can patrol more than 80 kilometers of reef each day. In a warm, shallow sea like this, you'd expect to find a coral reef. But here, there's something different. Instead of coral, these strange plant-like structures grow from hard limestone turrets and cover the seabed. They've built a reef-like structure just like coral.
This isn't a coral, but why not? When there's great change in the oceanic circulation or temperature, composition, corals are one of the first groups to disappear. So it's not surprising that corals have gone extinct. But the niche for a coral, the place of life for something that grows like a coral, still exists. And other organisms can form solid structures on the shallow floor of the ocean, which we would call reefs, that come from very different backgrounds. And so it's not surprising here in the future that some other organism has stepped into this slot. And the organism that has stepped into this slot is a red alga. Now, actually, red algae have made reefs before. They were very important many times in the past, and they have simply come out of eclipse to take over again in the absence of corals.
These reefs of the future grow much faster than coral reefs. The warm, shallow water gets plenty of sunlight, which is ideal for the algae. But red algae still have a few problems to solve.
In the future, when red algae make huge reefs, they have to face the same problem that red algae have had to face their entire history. And that's that when they reproduce, their sperm cells can't swim. They can only crawl from one individual to another, and across huge reefs, that's just too far. So these red algae need help.
Help isn't far away. It comes from the reef gliders.
Now, the algae are flowering algae. They produce large conical structures that are a perfect match to the front end of the juvenile reef gliders. And the reef gliders feed off of these flower structures. But in addition, the pollen from the algae then coats the front surface of the reef gliders, and when they move to the next flower, they carry that pollen with them. Plants that we have in the present day do that all the time. We call it pollination, and it's mediated by lots of different animals that move pollen from one flower to the next. Birds, bees, other insects all move pollen, and red algae may well be able to use the same kind of thing far in the future.
The partnership between insects and plants, where insects get a sugar-rich nectar as a reward for carrying pollen from plant to plant, has been very successful for both partners. But it doesn't stop with insects. Some plants even cooperate with birds, or enlist the help of bats. In the future, the partnership between red algae and reef gliders works just as well. There are so many reef gliders among the reefs. This is why the ocean phantom comes here to feed. The problem is catching such active little creatures.
On the underneath of the ocean phantom are some sinister bell-looking objects. And what they are the mouths of the whole colony. They're suspended on a cable, like an umbilicus, and that cable lengthens and the mouth is lowered down to the reef. But it isn't just a mouth. It's in fact ringed by a set of eyes that look around, focus in on what possible prey items there are, and center that bell right over them. The bell is primed and pulled together, and at the right signal it springs open, sucking that prey right inside. Then the bell can close and the umbilicus can contract, pulling the whole prey and the mouth back up to the platform. The ocean phantom doesn't just get its food from underneath. In fact, gets a lot of its food from up above, because up above on its surface there are luxurious growths of algae. Now the algae photosynthesize. They absorb sunlight and turn that sunlight and carbon dioxide into sugars, and they pay for their ride by moving some of those sugars out of their own bodies into the body of the ocean phantom. So why does the ocean phantom get food from both sides? Using photosynthesis and sunlight from above, but still hunting below? Well, the algae provide a lot of energy, but it's like a diet of sugar cubes. It's just carbohydrate. Where do the other elements come from that the algae themselves need to grow? The proteins, the nitrogen, the phosphate, all of the other elements have to come from below when the ocean phantom feeds.
So the phantom catches reef gliders, partly to eat, and partly as fertilizer for the garden of algae growing on its back. But the reef gliders it eats are only babies, and eating someone else's babies is a dangerous game. Especially as the phantom is only a huge floating jelly with no obvious means of defense. All the time that the phantom is hunting baby reef gliders, the adult reef gliders are hunting it. Reef gliders can grow up to 3 meters long and weigh in at over a ton. Like their sea slug ancestors, they're carnivores.
The adult sea slugs, the reef gliders, feed on the ocean phantoms. They find them by swimming through the sea, picking up the scent of the ocean phantoms. They have horns on their head that pick that scent out of the water and allow them to direct their swimming right towards their prey.
An ocean phantom looks like easy prey for a big reef glider. But the phantom does have a defense. It has its own private army. Spindletroopers. Huge sea spiders that live in the chambers on the phantom rush to its defense. They'll attack anything, even a huge reef glider, irritating and harassing it until the reef glider backs off and leaves the phantom alone. The phantom doesn't get something for nothing. It has to feed its bodyguard of spindletroopers.
The defenders of the ocean phantom are sea spiders, these spindletroopers, about a meter long. And they're defending the ocean phantom against its predators because the ocean phantom is their home. And that's where they get their food from. Channels that go into the bells that the spindletroopers live in actually provide food to the spindletroopers from the ocean phantom itself. So this huge colony, this huge siphonophore is feeding its defenders in order to use them to drive off the predators. Now, in modern days, we see this all the time.
This tiny trapezoid crab lives among stag's horn coral and protects its home from coral-eating starfish. It nips at the sensitive feet with sharp claws, making the starfish think twice about attacking that particular coral.
Likewise, our spindletroopers are sea spiders. They have poisonous chelicera, claws at the front that they can use to slash at the sea slugs and drive them off the ocean phantom.
In these crowded, shallow seas, partnerships are a good way of increasing the odds of survival. Offering shelter, or food, or both, in exchange for protection. The ocean phantom gets a bodyguard in exchange for sharing some of its food. But even an army can't defend the ocean phantom against one danger. The weather. Huge storms, fed by all this warm, shallow water, produce high winds and enormous waves. Buffeted by the violent sea, the ocean phantom seems helpless. All it can do is lower its sails and wait for the storm to pass. But the ocean phantom is only a jellyfish after all. Violent winds and waves tear it apart. It looks like the end for this complex sailing machine. But as long as a broken piece of ocean phantom still has some members of each type of jelly, it can regrow. So the storm doesn't destroy the ocean phantom. It helps it reproduce, making more phantoms. A warm, shallow sea full of strange new life. Plants that have entered a partnership with reef gliders. The ocean phantom that supports its army of sea spiders and reproduces by riding a storm. As the shallow seas have spread over the planet, evolution has taken advantage of this rich habitat and created some bizarre creatures living in amazing partnerships. "100 million years in the future, a huge rainforest. dark, dense, and crowded with life. Strange birds and weird insects compete for food and space. But this forest is really bizarre. Not because of what lives here, but because of where it is. These lush forests cover the land that was once the frozen continent of Antarctica. Today, Antarctica, lying over the South Pole, is buried under thousands of meters of ice. So cold and bleak, it's almost empty of life.
Well, Antarctica, which is presently located over the South Pole and glaciated, has in essence been sterilized of most living things by the presence of the ice that has just literally rubbed them off and offers no place for an animal or a plant to grow.
But Antarctica hasn't always been an icy wilderness. Long ago, it was covered in forest. And it could be again. Because Antarctica is on the move.
As we approach 100 million years in the future, it begins to move off the South Pole, move northwards into warmer environments. But during this process, as it is in the present day, it has remained an isolated continent. So the only way that organisms are going to get to it is by long-distance dispersal. And this means that only certain kinds of organisms, things like birds or plants that have very small light seeds, only certain organisms are going to make it. And the end result is that the kinds of communities of plants and animals that develop on Antarctica are going to be highly unusual.
Although the communities here have evolved from very few original colonists, they now look like the animals and plants in rainforests today. That's because they live and eat in the same way.
100 million years in the future, Antarctica will be much further north than it is now. It'll be very different. It's not going to be covered in ice. It'll have trees and vegetation and all the animals which go with a habitat like that. And birds, though, which you'll find in Antarctica in the future, will have evolved while Antarctica was further south. They've therefore got to evolve from the species which are there now.
So birds were here all the time, though now they look completely different from their ancestors. What gives away their origins is their strange nostrils.
Our flutter birds are immediately recognizable as coming from a group of birds we're familiar with today. They have tube noses. The tube-nosed birds are called the petrels, and they're one of the dominant species in modern Antarctica. The best example are the albatrosses. They're tube noses because they have two small tubes on the top of the nose. We think this is used to measure the air currents, but we don't know that yet.
Ocean-going petrels turning into tiny, colourful forest birds. Even that's possible, because they could adapt over millions of years as Antarctica slowly changed. The continent is moving, and as it drifts north, away from the South Pole, the ice begins to melt. Further north, and the bare surface of the land is exposed for the first time in millions of years. As soil developed, grasses and sedges turned Antarctica green. Eventually, millions of years later, Antarctica arrived in the temperate zone, where trees could grow into the first forests. And once Antarctica reached the tropics, the cool temperate forests were replaced by dense rainforest. All this time, the Antarctic petrels had the continent to themselves, changing, evolving, turning into hundreds of new species. Flutterbirds, each kind finding its own way to make a living. But even a tiny change in design means a bird can make a living in a completely different way.
When you look at modern birds, there are perhaps 9,000 or 10,000 species of birds in the world today. They're very similar in the basic way they're built, but the different species all vary from each other slightly. They vary in the shapes and sizes of the wings. They vary in the beak and the feet, all kinds of features. Where they vary in the wings, this is because they're flying in different ways. You can look at a group of birds, say in a northern forest, half a dozen species of tits and similar birds. Some are flying around the tips of the branches, some are feeding on the bark, the trunk of the tree. And if you look at those birds, they'll all differ slightly in the design of the wings or the feet or the beak. Same principle that their design relates to the way they're feeding and what they're eating.
Optimum wing design is vital, particularly to a pursuit hunter like a sparrowhawk. It has short, rounded wings for fast, maneuverable flight, dodging and twisting through the forest as it chases smaller birds. In 100 million years' time, different wing designs mean dozens of different types of flutterbirds can make a living in the Antarctic rainforest. Some soar over the forest on long wings, others fly through the canopy on broad wings. But the most agile and maneuverable is the roachcutter. So fast, it can even snatch insects off a branch in flight. But some insects in this forest are simply too big to eat. This is a falconfly, and it eats birds. In this forest, the meanest predators are insects.
Today, the size of insects is determined by the richness of oxygen in the atmosphere. Oxygen is absorbed via little tubes inside the animal, and an insect can only grow so large. If the atmosphere were enriched in oxygen, they could grow bigger. It's happening in the future, but it happened in the past. In the Carboniferous coal swamps, there were huge dragonflies. There were millipede-like animals on the forest floor which were truly terrifying. They could get much larger because of the richer atmosphere. Well, it can happen again in the future, perhaps sufficient to turn an insect into a major predator.
The falconfly is a giant wasp. It has front legs that can spear birds in flight and powerful jaws to butcher its prey, as well as a venomous sting. The falconfly doesn't just eat the roachcutter, it carries juicy bits of its victim back to a hole on the forest floor. The hole is really the falconfly's nest. And living deep inside, its young is a massive 15-centimeter long maggot. A mother falconfly has to find a lot of meat to feed its monstrous baby. Surely such tender maternal care is unusual for an insect.
There are two strategies for reproduction if you're an insect. One is to lay vast numbers of eggs, of which only a few survive. The other is to lay very few eggs, but take special measures to ensure a high rate of survival. That's what the falconfly does. And there are many analogues in the living fauna. There is, for example, the sexton beetle that lays very few eggs on, for example, a buried mouse, and nurtures its young, actually feeds them to ensure a very high rate of survival.
So even today, insects aren't always absent parents. The falconfly has another problem. Not only does it have to find enough meat, it has to remember where the nest is.
Some insects have evolved very sophisticated ways of locating their larvae. They use the polarized light produced by the sun for navigation purposes. They have a memory for landmarks, and this enables them to very precisely retrace their steps.
The falconfly's ancestor, the sand wasp, also hides its maggots in holes in the ground and feeds them on paralyzed caterpillars. To find its nest again, it memorizes landmarks around the hole, stones, twigs, or plants. It's so confident it can find its burrow again, it even covers it with sand, disguising it from predators. The falconfly has a bigger problem. It has lots of nests scattered all over the forest and has to remember where each one is. A challenge for any insect. But there is one today with the brain power for this. The honeybee. A honeybee can remember the location of up to 4 different flowers. And even more, it remembers the time of day when each flower produces nectar. And they can find their way home from 4 kilometers away. To help returning bees, bees at the hive waft a scent from their tails, a kind of instrument landing system for bees on final approach. The falconfly has inherited all its ancestors' skills and easily finds its way back to each of its holes through the tangle of rainforest. But not all the birds are helpless against the giant falconfly. The spitfire bird is another kind of flutterbird, but one with a deadly weapon.
The spitfire bird has developed an extraordinary way of defending itself against predators. It squirts a hot, noxious fluid from its nose.
The explosion is caused by mixing two chemicals, each stored in a separate chamber. When threatened, the bird squeezes both chemicals into a special reaction chamber in its tubular nostrils. The two chemicals react violently, forcing the noxious steaming spray out of the nose.
Well, by mingling these two chemicals, the Spitfire bird makes a poisonous and hot spray. It may sound improbable, but among living animals there is the bombardier beetle, which does a similar mixture of two chemicals and produces a really hot spray which repels any predator instantly.
The bombardier beetle is patterned in black and yellow, a warning signal. Bright colors, black with orange or yellow, is insect code for leave me alone. The dazzling monarch butterfly is full of poisonous chemicals that leave a disgusting taste. And these red and black bugs hang around in gangs to reinforce the signal. And both the bugs and the monarchs get their nasty chemicals from the plants they eat. But in the future, the Spitfire bird's defense comes from a much closer relationship with a plant. This rainforest tree. Instead of sipping nectar, it sips chemicals from the flower. Highly reactive chemicals. So both chemicals can't be in the same flower or they'd explode. So the tree has developed male and female flowers, each with one of the chemicals. This forces the bird to visit both flowers in turn, providing the plant with a first-class pollination service. Falconflies are smart enough to stay away from the bright yellow colors of the Spitfire bird. But this time, it wasn't a real Spitfire bird.
The false Spitfire bird looks almost exactly the same as the real Spitfire bird. It's what we call a mimic. Nature is full of mimicry. Very often this mimicry is when a non-poisonous animal or a non-dangerous animal resembles a dangerous one. Very often the coloration is bright, a warning coloration. Think of bees and wasps. Think of brightly colored banded snakes. A predator is confused by this resemblance. So the non-poisonous one benefits from its resemblance to the poisonous one, and both are left well alone.
This is a deadly coral snake, and its bite is fatal. Predators learn to stay well away from its bright colors. But this is a harmless milk snake, and it looks just the same. In the heat of the moment, even the smartest predator can't tell them apart, so takes the safe way out and leaves the harmless snake alone. In the Antarctic rainforest, there are some very clever mimics, and they use their color schemes for a much more sinister purpose. These future beetles have evolved a way of tricking Spitfire birds and avoiding the spray of hot acid. They work together to mimic a flower of the Spitfire tree. They have wings and wing cases that are colored and shaped just like the petals of the Spitfire flower. And 4 of them, head to head on the trunk with their wings at just the right angle, transform into a flower.
Nature is full of camouflage. There are insects which imitate plants, leaves, flowers. The flower mantis, for example, carefully arranges its appendages, its limbs, so that it looks like an orchid.
Its disguise is good enough to fool most other insects. And mimicking a flower has another advantage. Your prey comes looking for you. But a mantis works alone. These beetles have to work together to catch a spitfire bird. Insects cooperating like this seems like a science fiction nightmare of the future. Foul-tasting gobs of vomit. But a flower made from cooperative beetles is more elegant, both in looks and in being the perfect way to catch spitfire birds. They only visit flowers when they run out of chemicals, and that's a good time to pounce. For the falconfly, these Antarctic rainforests are crowded with life. Evolution is an arms race. Attack and defense, measure and countermeasure. And to win this war, creatures in this forest must come up with new tricks and new alliances. It's places like these rainforest battlefields where animals and plants struggle to stay one step ahead of the game, that the powers of evolution are tested to the absolute limit.